Hello and welcome to the 2025 MIFF Schools program. I'm Josh Nelson, and on behalf of all of the team at MIFF, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we all live, learn and work, and to pay our respects to their elders past and present, and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Here at MIFF, we continue to celebrate the history and contemporary creativity of the world's oldest living culture. As those of you familiar with the MIFF Schools programs from previous years will no doubt already be aware, these presentations have been created as an educational resource for teachers and students, providing an overview of each film text, suggesting strategies for analysis and topics for classroom discussion, and tying together aspects from the films to the various assessment criteria found within the language courses offered under VCAR, and also to subjects such as English and EAL, literature, media studies, and the film study course for the International Baccalaureate. In each of those curriculums, there's a real key focus on developing students' visual literacy skills and encouraging students to critically engage with media texts across a range of contexts and mediums. And this obviously becomes a really key component of assessment as students progress into their final years of the VCE. So for that reason, film analysis will be a key focus of these presentations, not as a replacement or as a substitute for the focus on language and cultural aspects, but rather as something that can sit side by side those key focus areas. While the MIFF Schools program is perhaps ideally suited to students within the French, Japanese, Mandarin, Italian, German and English language courses, the selected films in this year's program offer opportunities for study and classroom analysis across a really diverse range of subjects, abilities and age groups, preparing students, as I mentioned, for those text-based assessments and really developing those visual literacy skills. Now, I'm going to focus on the film techniques and terminologies that students would ideally have a familiarity with in just a moment. But before I do that, here a brief synopsis of the film might be useful. Now, I should mention, this will be a relatively spoiler-free presentation. I'm going to avoid, as much as possible, giving away any crucial plot details or revelations within the films themselves, while still providing you with an overview of the content of the film and suggesting some strategies and suggestions for analysis that should really help structure that post-screening and pre-screening classroom discussion and context. Têtes, Brûlée is a French, Arabic and Dutch language film centering around a 12-year-old girl of Tunisian heritage, Aya, as she grieves the loss of her beloved adult brother, Younes. Living in Brussels with her Tunisian migrant family, Aya, caught between cultures and traditions, must come to terms with the sudden absence of her strongest ally and supporter. Struggling to process her grief, she finds solace in the friends, relatives and neighbours who fill the family home in the aftermath, and who all resolve to find some way to honour Younes while learning to live without him. Winner of 2 special mentions at the 2025 Berlinale, Belgian-Tunisian-Danish filmmaker Marja Ajmer Ida Zalama has drawn from her own family history in developing this striking debut feature. A tender depiction of ritual and community, ushering people through the stages of grief, as well as a poignant narrative of innocence lost, Têtes, Brûlée is a coming-of-age tale imbued with dramatic weight and shot through with humanity. But before we look at this film in more detail, I do want to return to the terminology and techniques that I flagged at the beginning of the presentation, and that real core focus on developing students' visual literacy skills. And so I would actually recommend to teachers that prior to attending the screening, it might be really useful to either introduce, depending on the age level of the students, or at least revise a selection of key film terminology and techniques that students should really be thinking about while they're watching the film. Because, and I realize I say this every year, it's crucially important to reinforce the need for students to actively engage with these films. Yes, they're entertaining, yes, films are fun, but there also needs to be that expectation placed upon students that they'll be watching these films in order to analyse them. Whether that's as part of a non-English language course, or English, EAL, media, or a film studies unit. And on that, I would actually suggest that students take notes, or be encouraged to take notes during the screening. It's one way to ensure that they're going to be actively engaging with what they're seeing on screen. Now, I'll talk about some of these elements in relation to the specific film in more detail shortly, but just as a general overview of film techniques, something that might be beneficial prior to the screening, this might be a useful starting point. And look, there's no shortage of film resources online that can assist in that process, whether that's on YouTube or in, say, textbook form. I would also really emphasize from the outset that it's important that students can firstly identify the technique that's being used, that secondly, they can understand its general function in the context of film language and filmmaking, especially in terms of creating meaning within the film itself from a filmmaker's perspective. And then thirdly, that they can apply that knowledge to an analysis of the specific text in the context of the narrative, the characters, the themes and ideas that the film's exploring. And it's very difficult to achieve that final outcome unless those first two learning aims have been properly established and understood. And so with that in mind, some of the basic techniques that students should ideally be familiar with are things like cinematography, whether that's the close-up or a wide-angle shot or camera movement, the various components of mise-en-scène, which incorporates elements such as props, costumes, the use of lighting, the blocking of actors, the composition of the frame, where relevant, music and also lyrics, sound, dialogue, the use of voiceover, editing, narrative structure and story elements, and also visual motifs and symbolism. And so, as I mentioned, these are effectively the building blocks of filmmaking. So it's really essential, I think, that students have an awareness of these and come into the screenings with that awareness. Okay, so looking at the film in a little more detail now. Some of the key themes and issues and ideas that are explored within Têtes Brûlée are obviously grief and mourning are very much at the forefront of the film. It deals with family and friendship, issues of hope and acceptance, community, the migrant experience and multiculturalism. There's a focus on traditions, on music and dance, on religion, and bracketing much of this, really, through the experience of grief and loss, is the notion of Aya's coming of age. And I'll talk about a selection of these in more detail as we go along. When I approach a film text with a class, depending on the age group and the academic level, I often like to start from the big picture and then gradually work in towards the focused film and scenic analysis. And there are a number of contexts here that I think you could use this film to explore wider social, cultural aspects that the film touches on, either prior to the screening to give students a sort of knowledge base to help them understand the film while they're watching it, or certainly in that post-screening classroom discussion to develop students' understanding. So as I mentioned in the synopsis, Têtes Brûlée explores issues related to grief and mourning in the immediate aftermath of an unexpected death. So a number of potential contexts here that are worth pursuing. Obviously, the psychology of death and mourning, the processes of grief. Now, you don't necessarily need to prescribe to the 5 stages of grief model, but it's one way, I think, of approaching this film through psychological theories about grief and mourning. And I think that Wikipedia reference, even though, yes, it's Wikipedia, would be an ideal launching off point to give students a kind of an understanding of the sort of various processes and reactions that we often experience to grief, to help students perhaps who may not have experienced grief at a young age, what the character of Aya is going through within this film. I think you could also look at some of the cultural aspects in more detail, the Maghreb or cultural heritage that Aya and her family come from, or Tunisian diaspora and notions of migration through the specific lens of Tunisia, or the film's Belgium setting would be another one, And I think students who may not be familiar with Islamic funerals, the specifics of the burial traditions within that particular context. Another context that I think students may find really useful in relation to this or any other film is delving a little into the production background. And here I think interviews with the director, Marja Ajmir Ida Zalama, would really enhance students' understandings of the creative process and what her intentions may have been for the film. Where did the inspirations for the film come from, for example? What was she setting out to do in making the film? And in terms of her stylistic and formal approaches, which I'll touch on in just a moment, how did they shape meaning? What was she intending in and through those particular creative decisions? And here I've listed a reference to a particularly good interview with her from Cine Europa, where she remarks, "I'd made a self-produced short film on the same subject, and after seeing it, the filmmaker, who's also a producer, suggested I turn it into a feature film. It seemed obvious when he said it, but it had never occurred to me to do it before. It's a story which is similar to my own and to my family's. I needed to tell it. I fictionalized a lot of it to achieve the right distance. It was a process of deconstructing and then reconstructing for me." So a little bit of an insight there, I think, on her personal connection to the material, which certainly I think comes through in the film, and no doubt a number of the students will pick up on that after or during the screening. Another context, sort of moving closer into the film now, would be to look at it through the lens of form and style. So though it may be fictional or fictionalized, as Zalama points out, Têtes, Brûlée employs certain techniques that connects the film to the traditions of documentary cinema. So for example, handheld cinematography. A lot of this film is shot in that handheld approach, following characters through various rooms, as opposed to using static, fixed cameras. The use of long single takes. There's not a lot of editing in particular within certain scenes. We're left as an audience to sit in the moment as the actors perform, and it's incredibly effective too. There's also a reliance on diegetic music. Now, if students aren't familiar with this term, diegetic music just means music that's occurring within the context of the narrative world, within the stories, that the characters can hear in the story, as opposed to it being non-diegetic music, which is additional soundtrack, which is just for the benefit of the audience. And also the casting of some non-professional actors. So I would ask students to consider, how does the use of these techniques, which have these connections to documentary filmmaking, construct a very particular kind of realism within the film? In which shots or scenes or sequences does the film appear to achieve that distinct documentary sensibility? Where are students most aware of the film achieving that kind of realism? And perhaps putting it to students, before they read the interview, why might the filmmaker have opted not to tell the story, or her story, in the form of a documentary? And then, based on their responses, you could introduce prompts or elements or quotes from the interview, like the one here where Zalama says, "It's clear that a documentary would have individualized the story, whereas fiction allows it to be universal. And it's true that when the film was presented in Berlin, lots of people from all over the world told me how good it was to feel that they'd been represented in a different way. When I was small, I was really impacted by the issue of representation, especially when it came to reading. I felt like I couldn't see myself anywhere. It's something I'm very sensitive to, and if I'm honest, I would definitely have preferred for my film to be one in a long line of films telling stories about people who look like the people in my film. I never wanted to be the first." Number of really important points that she's raising in there, not the least of which is the issue of representation. So you could use that as a prompt in terms of the formal aspects of the film and its connections to documentary cinema, and why it was important for Zalama not to present this as a documentary. And also these questions about representation would potentially provoke some quite detailed discussion within the classroom about the importance of representation, not just for this film, but other cultural films, other characters or subjects or identities that we don't tend to see on screen all that often, and why it's important that we do. So returning to the point I made at the beginning of the presentation in regards film techniques and film terminology. So just to recap, the importance that students can, one, identify the film technique, That 2, they have a sense of its general function within the context of film language or the language of cinema. And 3, that they can apply that knowledge to the specific context in which it's being used within a given film text, a scene, a sequence, a shot, whatever it might be. So, a close-up shot being used in this instance and more generally to create that identification between a character and the audience, fostering that sort of sense of intimacy through the proximity of the camera to the lens, to the screen, to the audience. And here we have a close-up being used very early on within the film. Yunus has just collected his sister Aya from school, and the close-up is reaffirming not just our intimacy to her as a character and reaffirming her as a central presence within the film, but their relationship as well. Contrast that to, say, the wide-angle shot. Wide angles provide a very different proximity between us and the character. There's a different emotional connection that's borne out through that spatial distance. So here we have a wide-angle shot, Aya by herself, sort of centrally focused in the frame, but in the deep or deeper background of the shot. So again, students could identify the wide-angle shot. They could explain that it's typically used to provide context, setting, situate a character in their world, but it also achieves symbolic connotations and emotional connotations. And here, the wide-angle shot is emphasizing her sense of isolation and loneliness, which is something Salama does at a number of points within the film. I mentioned handheld cinematography as a key aspect of the documentary approach. And again, here we have a key moment where that's being used, sort of pursuing Aya through the corridors. There's some other elements that I would also draw your attention to, or for students to be mindful of. For example, the use of focus. Here in that bottom left-hand image, we have Aya seated in the background with her family around her, who are slightly out of focus, but she's the focal point of the scene, like she is the focal point of the film. But again, the composition and the use of focus is important. She remains our focal point, even though she's surrounded by all these other people who are sort of crowded in around her. There's that tension within the shot itself through the use of focus between the background and the foreground and the action that's going on. Also thinking about the symbolism of compositions throughout the film and the use of lighting, which I'll touch on in just a moment. But in the deep background, we have Aya in prayer, in the deep background, in focus, light around her immediate body, but surrounded by darkness within the frame. So there's an interesting tension within that, which offers up scope for numerous interpretations about her response to grief in terms of her isolation, her seeking solace perhaps in religion and prayer. Again, breaking these scenes and sequences and shots down for deeper analysis is a really key aspect of textual analysis when it comes to cinema. And another really great shot within the film that has these connotations in the bottom right-hand corner of Aya, again in focus, but completely swamped within the frame. Again, is this suggesting that the world has kind of closed in on her? She's alone in a sense while she's crowded. And again, the use of focus, the use of composition, the use of blocking within the frame, I think evokes or provokes a number of potential interpretations. So mise-en-scène, I mentioned lighting just before. Mise-en-scène is a key term within film analysis referring to everything that goes on within the frame. So lighting, composition, props, the blocking of actors, the use of costumes. How does the visual design, the production design of the film convey meaning to an audience within a particular frame? And here we have some examples where I think even in the absence of dialogue, the filmmaker is just using visuals to convey to the audience aspects of character, their emotional state, the world in which they live. So again, returning to early on within the film, a shot of Aya and Yunus riding home after school. The warmth of the sun evokes and reaffirms the kind of intimacy of their relationship, the connection between them. Aya's bedroom, I would ask students to consider what that mise-en-scène conveys about her character, her fascinations, her interests, the use of colour within the frame there as well, and contrast that to, say, the mise-en-scène of the car journey, where she's just discovered the news about her brother's death. The cold morning light behind her, the blacks and the blues. a stark contrast to that first image on the left-hand side. So again, asking students to contrast mise-en-scène at various points within the film and what those differences or similarities suggest. Music is another really important element of this film. As I mentioned, the diegetic soundtrack. And the film features songs and music played on phones, or via headphones, through social media, on the radio, as well as from individuals who sing at various points. So how is Zalama using music to give us this immediate sense of character? What types of music are heard within the film? And how do these differing styles reflect thematic conflicts in the film, or generational tensions, or issues to do with cultural traditions? Why is music perhaps so important for the character of Aya? And again, some of the music that's heard within the film soundtrack: Ocean Drive by La Crime and La Grinta by, I'm going to say Dizzy Style, or Diz Style. Apologies, I'm not familiar with Diz Style. Language students could certainly be tasked with translating those lyrics in class. They're available online, you can easily track them down. And then reflecting on the significance of lyrics of these or any other pieces of music heard within the film, and their connection to the wider themes and characters as well. The motif of dance is another recurring one throughout the film. So, a bit like music, what meanings might the act of dancing have for Aya? How might the importance of dance, or self-expression more generally, change over the course of the narrative? And especially as she attempts to come to terms with her grief over the loss of her brother. And it's interesting thinking about the character of Aya and the multiculturalism within the film, or being torn between two cultures, because we see her, with a friend in one particular scene where they're practicing a kind of TikTok or social media dance, and then that's contrasted with more traditional forms of dance elsewhere. So again, dance is used within the film to reflect Aya's existence across both of these spheres. And I thought her comment about body language was relevant here in that interview, where she says, "Generally speaking, I find body language really important. If I could get rid of even more dialogue, I'd do it. Aya reacts in a natural way, without asking questions. If she wants to stand on her head, dance, turn her music up full blast, she does it. There's something a little animalistic in how she reacts." That is an ideal quote or prompt for classroom discussion. In what ways do the students react to that? How do they see this animalistic quality? Does that shed light on Aya's character in a way that students may not have considered while watching the film? Obviously, as I mentioned earlier, themes of grief and mourning are very much at the forefront within the film. So in what ways does Zalama explore a range of human responses to the death of Eunice? And students could focus their analysis on a particular scene or sequence or contrasting scenes to discuss or analyse those differing responses, and how that differing response to grief or mourning differs across the lines of age or gender or cultural or other distinctions within the film. There's an incredible sequence, mostly involving Eunice's close male friendship group, and Aya is sort of party to this sequence, sitting in as these young men react in very different ways. It's sort of an ideal demonstration of the kind of stages of grief all happening at once. And Zalama touches on this again in that interview, where she says, "There are boys and men who accept their vulnerability, which is an alternative image to the one we've come to expect. There was one reaction to the film which really touched me. It was a young boy who I'd come across through certain professional connections, and when someone asked him what he'd say to recommend the film to his friends, he replied, 'Take off your armour and come see this film. We pretend we're hard, but when it comes to death, we're all the same, and it does us good to be able to cry too.'" I think that's an excellent prompt, and again, I think reflecting on scenes like the one I've screenshotted there really bear out exactly what she's talking about in that moment. And we come back to the issue of representation as well. So there are a number of points where you can broaden the scope for discussion depending on the age level or academic level of the students. The theme of gender and age are also, I think, really key within this film. So the themes of gender and age across issues of roles, responsibilities, expectations, cultural and religious traditions are present throughout. And what's interesting here in this film is the way in which Aya is frequently shown crossing between the groups of men and women within the film. So I think students really need to consider the significance of Aya's role in these wider contexts in which identity is being understood or represented through the lens of gender and of age. And as we see there in some of these screenshots, we have a family member come up and tell Aya, your mum and sister are downstairs, they need you. She's been hanging with Eunice's male friends and now it's time to rejoin the women. Or this question about how she's responding, and someone at the wake or in this period of mourning says, Wasila, how old is she? Oh, she's a child. So again, age and gender are sort of intertwined in certain ways. And as we see with the burial, we have Aya initially with the women and then crossing over to be with the men. And I think those actions take on a heightened symbolic significance within the film. Again, Zalama elaborates here and she says, Aya is age 12, between childhood and adolescence. So again, in between. I was interested in showing how much more responsible we can be at that age than as adults, but all the while remaining a child. Her escapes are dancing, having a laugh with her brother's friends. From the outset, I imagined Aya to be a child who was strong, the child I would have liked to have been. Hands are another really key recurring motif within the film, and I would ask students to consider what differing kinds of meanings are hands imbued with over the course of the narrative. Why might they be so important in the context, again thinking about connection to themes, in the context of grieving or the mourning process? So how does the film's focus on hands connect to other themes and motifs within the film, such as dance, such as prayer and religion, such as individuality and freedom, and other traditions such as those related to food, food and the sort of sense of community that comes in and through food at key points within the film. I think, and the use of hands with that is also key. And I think just in these 8 images from the film, you get a sense of the key focus that Zalama has with her camera on hands connection, hands in prayer, hands in consolation, hands on the back of a motorbike as Aya sort of lets her hand fly free, hands on bodies, hands at funerals. There are a number of other cultural, religious, historical, linguistic and other references that I think could be brought up in classroom discussion or returned to in that post-screening context in order to really deepen students' understandings of what they've seen, the film's various cultural influences and its representations. So here are some just to flag that you might want to come back to. So we have references to both haram and halal. We have references to food, like I mentioned, as a key motif. There's a reference to the spreekbeurt, which is a presentation, an oral presentation, and we see I give one early on within the film, or start to give one on the Flemish poet Paul van Ostaaien. And again, students might not be familiar with him. You could introduce that as an element to connect back to the film's cultural context. We have the Hamdulillah. We have references to the Misbah, the prayer beads, or the Umrah, which is the pilgrimage to Mecca. And I couldn't not mention this because it's a key element within the film, certainly through Aya and Eunice's relationship, which is, of course, football, or soccer, as Australians might like to call it. We see football in conversation between her and her brother. We see football being a key moment of her and her friend when she's staying over, and they're watching and cheering for Morocco. Again, another key cultural reference there. What's the relationship between Tunisia and Morocco, say, in supporting one another at international sporting events? We see Aya wear a Tunisian club jersey at a number of key points within the film. Again, these are all references that I think you could pick up on to develop and deepen students' understandings of the film. So without giving anything away, the concluding imagery of the film, asking students to consider what impression does Zalama leave us with at the end of the film? What's the tone of the ending? I think these are key questions for students to consider. Is there a sense of resolution, or do doubts and ambiguities about certain characters' futures persist? And I say this in all the presentations, it's really key to encourage a range of interpretations in the students' responses. There is no one right or one wrong way of interpreting a film. Ideally, you would like students to be able to draw on evidence from the film to support their interpretation, observation, argument, analysis. But impress upon them that, art is subjective, interpretation is subjective. So here we have these key images of Aya towards the end. Now, in terms of discussing the ending of the film, I would draw students' attention to some particular elements. So, for example, students should be able to identify the way that the film's concluding moments return to the theme of religion, of tradition, of grief, the motif of the hands, and to gender roles, for example, through the setting of Aya's bedroom, as well as to the symbolism of the costume. And here we have her wearing Eunice's Tunisian football club jersey. So again, as I mentioned, football, soccer, important, while holding the misbah, the prayer beads. These are all elements that students could draw on in their discussion about the ending. In terms of unifying these various elements in the form of assessment, an approach I think is really valuable would be to have students either reading and critically engaging with other published reviews of the film, and then respond by writing their own, whether that's in English or, for non-English language groups, the particular language in question. The key element, I think, with the assessment task of a review is to impress upon students that they need to draw on the close analysis of the film that's obviously been developed in and through that classroom discussion, and ideally utilizing the kinds of terminology that I've mentioned throughout this presentation, those film techniques, that language of cinema. And here's an excerpt from a review published on Cine Europa by Aurora Engelin, who writes, "Têtes Brûlée is a film of few words but many gestures, of hands reaching out and arms which embrace and console. By focusing on Aya and conveying her childlike energy in a world of grown-ups at a time which tends to belong to adults, Marja Admir Ida Zalama captures the strength and fragility of moments such as these, when life gets back on track, in spite of grief. In the space of a few days, Aya takes the path of resilience. It's not a precocious coming-of-age tale leading Aya towards adolescence or adulthood that the director is offering up here, but rather the story of a childhood which has been rocked, in which our protagonist withstands the pain of loss by using the weapons in her reach, sincerity and an ability to look for joy where it can be found, to turn beautiful memories into strength and to unleash her creativity, and ultimately to experience this grief as a sadness forever anchored in her heart, but also, by necessity, as a transformative process." And with that, we have reached the end of the presentation. For information regarding bookings, age suitability, or additional details for all of the films in this year's MIFF Schools program, head on over to miff.com.au/schools, where you will find all the information and resources, as well as links to the rest of this year's festival program and screenings. And so, on behalf of myself, Josh Nelson, and MIFF Schools programmer Kate Fitzpatrick, we'd like to thank you for watching this presentation and to wish you a very enjoyable and, more importantly, educationally rewarding experience at this year's film festival. Thanks so much.